There's a moment we could begin this story with. Not January 30th, 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor. Not the Reichstag fire. Not Kristallnacht. But November 1918. Germany has just surrendered in the First World War. A young corporal lies in a military hospital in Pasewalk. He's temporarily blind, the after-effects of a gas attack. He lies in the dark and hears someone nearby announce, "The war is over. Germany has lost." Adolf Hitler would later write in Mein Kampf that this was the night he decided to enter politics. To save Germany. This is quite possibly a literary legend. Hitler loved embellishing his own biography. But symbolically, it's accurate. Because the Third Reich wasn't really born in 1933. It was born earlier, in the humiliation of defeat, in the chaos of revolution, in a trauma the nation never managed to process. Today, the story of how the Reich was born. Not the story of one man. The story of a country that created the conditions for one man to become an absolute ruler over the lives and deaths of 80 million people. From the defeat of 1918 to the complete Nazi dictatorship of 1934. 16 years. 16 years that led from democracy to totalitarianism. How did this happen? Step by step. World War I ended for Germany in a strange way. The German army wasn't defeated on the battlefield in the conventional sense. When the armistice was signed, German troops were still standing on foreign soil. In France, in Belgium, in Russia. Where, after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany occupied enormous territories. Inside Germany, no foreign troops, no occupation, no German cities destroyed by ground combat. And yet, defeat. Why? The German economy had been exhausted by 4 years of naval blockade. The Allied fleet had cut off food and raw material imports. By 1918, Germany was experiencing genuine famine. The so-called turnip winter of 1916 to 1917 had already claimed tens of thousands of lives from malnutrition. The army was worn out. Germany's last major offensive in spring 1918, the Kaiserschlacht, had failed. The Allies, bolstered by fresh American troops, launched a counteroffensive. German military command, chiefly General Ludendorff, understood the war was militarily lost and made a decision that shaped all of subsequent German history. Transfer responsibility for negotiating the armistice to the civilian government. This wasn't a noble sacrifice. It was a calculated maneuver. The military wanted civilian politicians, not the army, to sign the humiliating armistice. So the army's reputation would remain untarnished. On October 3, 1918, a new government was formed under Prince Max of Baden, including Social Democrats for the first time in German imperial history. This government began armistice negotiations. And at this exact moment, the country began to collapse from within. Late October 1918. The Kiel Mutiny. The German Navy received orders to sail out for one last suicidal battle against the British fleet, a purely symbolic gesture meant to salvage the honor of the German Navy in the face of inevitable defeat. The sailors refused. This turned into an uprising. Sailors' councils. Ships seized. The rebellion spread through port cities, Kiel, Hamburg, Lübeck. Within days, a revolutionary wave swept across all of Germany. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne. The German Empire ceased to exist. That same day, two competing declarations. Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann, from the Reichstag balcony, proclaimed the German Republic. Karl Liebknecht, leader of the far-left Spartacists, proclaimed a free socialist Republic of Germany, modeled on Soviet Russia. This was a moment of enormous uncertainty. Where would Germany go? Toward parliamentary democracy? Toward a Soviet-style revolution following the Russian model? Moderate Social Democrats, led by Friedrich Ebert, feared a Bolshevik scenario. They struck an unspoken alliance with the army leadership, General Groener, Ludendorff's successor. The deal was simple. The army would support the new Republican government and help crush the radical left revolution. In exchange, the Social Democratic government would leave the army structure, the officer corps, and the military elite untouched. This was a deal with the devil that would shape the fate of the Weimar Republic for years to come. January 1919. The Spartacist uprising in Berlin was crushed by Freikorps forces, paramilitary units made up of demobilized soldiers, many of whom held far-right views. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, the leaders of the radical left, were captured and killed by the Freikorps without trial. Their bodies were dumped in a canal. This murder became one of the first acts of political violence that would define the character of the entire Weimar Republic, violence that the state either sanctioned or simply couldn't prevent. The Freikorps, these volunteer detachments, would become the breeding ground for the future Nazi movement. Many future SA stormtroopers and SS leaders passed through the Freikorps as their formative school. June 28, 1919. The Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. German representatives sign a treaty they didn't choose and couldn't alter. We've covered the terms in detail elsewhere: territorial losses, reparations, military restrictions, the war guilt clause. But here it's important to focus on the psychological effect. The Treaty of Versailles was perceived in Germany by practically the entire political spectrum, from far right to moderate social democrats, as a national humiliation. This created a remarkable situation. The republic that had carried Germany through defeat and revolution was forced to sign a treaty it itself despised. The Weimar Republic was born with a curse on its forehead. Every government that signed or implemented the terms of Versailles was viewed by a significant portion of the population as traitors. A legend arose about the November criminals, the November Verbrecher. According to this legend, the German army had never been defeated on the battlefield. It had been betrayed from within. Socialists, communists, liberals, and, in the anti-Semitic version of the legend, Jews, had delivered the army a stab in the back, the Dolchstoß. This was a monstrous lie. The German army had genuinely suffered military defeat. But the legend proved convenient. It absolved the military elite of responsibility and shifted it onto the civilian politicians of the new republic. Hitler used this legend thousands of times in his speeches. It was the foundation of his early political capital. On August 11, 1919, the Weimar Constitution was adopted, named for the city where the Constituent Assembly convened, since Berlin was gripped by revolutionary unrest. By formal standards, it was one of the most progressive democratic constitutions of its time. Universal suffrage, including women, which was rare for that era. A proportional electoral system. A broad list of civil rights. A federal structure. But the Constitution contained mechanisms that would later prove fatally dangerous. Article 48. On the President's emergency powers. It allowed the President, in the event of a serious threat to public order, to issue decrees with the force of law, temporarily suspending fundamental civil rights without requiring parliamentary approval in every individual case. This article was created for emergency situations, to protect the young republic from internal threats. But it also contained the seed for the future destruction of that very democracy it was meant to protect. The proportional electoral system, every party receives seats in parliament proportional to its share of the vote, with no minimum threshold to enter, led to extreme fragmentation of the political spectrum. Dozens of small parties, endless coalition negotiations, chronic government instability. Over the 14 years of the Weimar Republic's existence, more than 20 governments came and went. Democracy existed formally, but it lacked what historians call democrats, a sufficient number of people genuinely committed to the very idea of parliamentary democracy, willing to defend it. The army, formally subordinate to the republic, remained internally loyal to the old imperial values. The judicial system was staffed with conservative judges who systematically handed down lenient sentences to right-wing extremists and harsh ones to leftists. This was a democracy built by people who, for the most part, didn't believe in it. 1923 became a year of multiple crises that nearly destroyed the young republic well before Hitler ever came to power. Germany couldn't make reparations payments at the agreed rate. In January 1923, France and Belgium, in response to a coal delivery shortfall, occupied the Ruhr region, Germany's main industrial zone. The German government declared a policy of passive resistance. Ruhr workers stopped working, refusing to cooperate with the occupying authorities. The government kept paying their wages by printing money with no real economic backing whatsoever. The result, hyperinflation that became a textbook example of what happens when a state loses control over its money supply. In January 1923, the dollar was worth about 18,000 marks. By November of the same year, 4.2 trillion marks. This wasn't simply high inflation. This was the complete wipeout of an entire generation's savings. People who had spent their whole lives putting money aside for old age, for their children's education, for a home, lost everything within months. Pensions became worthless. Insurance policies became scrap paper. There are famous photographs from this period, people hauling wages home in wheelbarrows because cash lost value faster than it could be spent. Bread that cost a few thousand marks in the morning could cost several million by evening. Hyperinflation wiped out the middle class, the social group that normally serves as the backbone of stable democracy. People who lost everything in this catastrophe became receptive to radical political ideas, promising simple solutions and convenient scapegoats. It was precisely in this atmosphere of chaos that, on November 8th to 9th, 1923, Hitler made his first serious attempt to seize power. By 1923, Hitler had already led the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, founded back in 1919 to 1920, for several years. The party had grown from a marginal Munich group into a relatively notable force in Bavarian politics, thanks to Hitler's oratorical talent, an organizational structure that included the SA stormtroopers and the general atmosphere of political chaos. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and his followers attempted a coup d'état, modeled on Mussolini's march on Rome a year earlier. The plan was bold and poorly thought out. Hitler burst into the Burger Bräukeler beer hall in Munich, where a gathering of Bavarian political leaders was taking place. He declared a national revolution. At gunpoint, he forced the local leaders to verbally pledge support for the putsch. The following day, a march of Nazi supporters through downtown Munich was supposed to grow into a seizure of power in Bavaria, and then, in Hitler's vision, into a nationwide revolution modeled on Rome. The march was stopped by Bavarian police at the Feldherrenhalle. A shootout broke out. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers were killed. Hitler was injured. He dislocated his shoulder when he fell, pulled down by the body of a comrade who'd been shot beside him. He fled. He was arrested 2 days later. The putsch failed, completely and humiliatingly. But here begins the paradox that, in many ways, shaped Germany's subsequent fate. Hitler's trial in February to March 1924 turned into a political triumph instead of a humiliation. The judge, sympathetic to nationalist views, allowed Hitler to use the trial as a propaganda platform. Hitler delivered hours-long speeches that were widely published in the press. The sentence was symbolically lenient for a crime of high treason, 5 years imprisonment, of which Hitler served less than 9 months, under comfortable conditions in Landsberg Fortress. It was in Landsberg that Hitler dictated Mein Kampf, the book that became Nazism's ideological Bible. The leniency of the sentence symbolizes the very problem of the Weimar Republic discussed earlier. The judicial system didn't take right-wing extremism seriously as a threat. If Hitler had received the full sentence, if he'd been deported as an undesirable foreigner, he was an Austrian citizen until 1932. History might have unfolded differently. It didn't. From 1924 to 1929, Germany went through a period of relative stabilization, sometimes called the Golden Twenties. The Dawes Plan of 1924 restructured reparation payments, making them more manageable. American loans flowed into the German economy. Industry began recovering. Berlin's cultural scene flourished: cabaret, cinema, avant-garde art. During these years, the NSDAP remained a marginal force. In the 1928 elections, the party won just 2.6% of the vote. It seemed as though Nazism had been a historical fluke, a product of post-war chaos that would dissolve as the economy stabilized. But the stability was illusory and fragile. The German economy remained critically dependent on American loans. Structural problems, high unemployment in certain sectors, uneven distribution of wealth, ongoing resentment over the Treaty of Versailles hadn't gone anywhere. They had simply been temporarily muffled by an inflow of foreign capital. October 24, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashes. The Great Depression. American banks began massively recalling short-term loans extended to German companies and municipalities. The German economy, built on these loans as its foundation, began collapsing almost immediately. By 1932, Germany had roughly 6 million officially registered unemployed. The real number, accounting for those who'd given up registering, the partially employed, and family members of the unemployed, was significantly higher. This meant a third of Germany's working-age population had no stable income. The economic collapse hit every social group, but particularly those already made vulnerable by the hyperinflation of 1923. Small business owners, farmers, young people unable to find their first job, war veterans who'd never managed to reintegrate into the peacetime economy. In this situation, the NSDAP began a rapid ascent. In the September 1930 elections, the party won 18.3% of the vote, a sudden jump from 2.6% 2 years earlier. By July 1932, 37.4%. The largest party in the Reichstag, though without an absolute majority. What explains this meteoric rise? Hitler and the NSDAP offered simple explanations for a complex economic crisis. The fault didn't lie with structural problems in the world economy. The fault lay with specific enemies. The Treaty of Versailles, the November criminals, Jews, communists. Nazi propaganda was organized professionally and was emotionally effective. Mass rallies, powerful visual symbolism, promises of national rebirth. Meanwhile, the Communist Party of Germany was also growing, also offering a radical solution to the crisis. Germany of 1930 to 1932 was being torn apart between two extremes, far-right and far-left radicalism, while moderate democratic parties hemorrhaged support. Street violence became routine. SA stormtroopers and communist combat units engaged in regular clashes. In 1932, political violence claimed hundreds of lives. Here we need to debunk a common oversimplification that Hitler came to power purely through mass voter support. This is an incomplete truth. The NSDAP genuinely had become the largest party. But even at the peak of its popularity in July 1932, it never won a parliamentary majority. Most Germans, nearly two-thirds, voted for other parties. Hitler came to power through a complex combination of electoral success and backroom maneuvering by the conservative elite. President Paul von Hindenburg, an 85-year-old field marshal from World War I, deeply disliked and distrusted Hitler, whom he considered an upstart and a bohemian corporal. But Hindenburg's inner circle, chiefly former Chancellor Franz von Papen, devised a plan to use Hitler for their own purposes. The logic ran as follows. The NSDAP was the largest party but lacked a majority. If Hitler were brought into government as chancellor but surrounded by conservative ministers who would actually control policy, the Nazis' mass popularity could be leveraged to stabilize a right-wing coalition, while real power remained in the hands of the traditional elite. Papen told his allies bluntly, "Within 2 months, we'll have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he'll be squealing." This was a catastrophic miscalculation. On January 30, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler Reich Chancellor. Of the 11 members of the cabinet, only 3 were Nazis, Hitler himself and 2 others. The conservatives were confident they had the situation under control. They were fundamentally wrong. On February 27, 1933, 1 month after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, the Reichstag building went up in flames. Who actually set the fire is a question historians still debate. The official Nazi version, that a lone Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, acted alone, is supported by most modern historical research. An alternative version, popular among some historians, particularly in the first post-war decades, holds that the Nazis themselves organized the fire to create a pretext. Regardless of who actually started the fire, the Nazi leadership immediately and effectively exploited the event. The next day, February 28, 1933, Hindenburg signed, at Hitler's urging, the Reichstag Fire Decree, officially the decree for the protection of the people and the state. This decree, issued under the infamous Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, suspended most civil liberties: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, privacy of correspondence, the inviolability of the home. The decree was formally a temporary emergency measure. It remained in effect until the very end of the Nazi regime in 1945. This is a critically important point for understanding how the Reich was born. Not through a single act of seizing power, but through a succession of temporary emergency measures that were never rescinded. Using their new powers, the Nazis immediately began arresting communist and social democratic activists. The first concentration camps, not yet death camps, but places of detention for political prisoners, began appearing as early as March 1933. Dachau, the first of them, opened on March 22, 1933. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag voted on the Enabling Act, the Ermächtigungsgesetz. This law allowed the government, meaning in effect Hitler, to enact laws without parliamentary approval, including laws that deviated from the Constitution. This was, in essence, an act of legal suicide by parliamentary democracy. The parliament voluntarily voted to surrender its own powers to the executive. Passing the law required a two-thirds majority. By this point, communist deputies had already been arrested or were in hiding. Their mandates effectively nullified. Some social democratic deputies also faced pressure and were unable to attend. The only party that openly and unanimously voted against it was the Social Democratic Party of Germany. Party leader Otto Wels delivered a speech defending democracy and human dignity, one of the last moments of open parliamentary resistance to Nazism. Hitler responded with a furious tirade, interrupting his planned remarks to personally attack the Social Democrats. The law passed 444 votes to 94. From this moment on, the Reichstag as a genuine legislative body effectively ceased to exist. Germany became a dictatorship, formally still within the framework of the still technically valid Weimar Constitution, but in reality, operating outside any constitutional constraints whatsoever. The following months of 1933 unfolded under a process the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, coordination, or bringing into line. The essence of the process, the destruction or forced subordination under Nazi control of every independent civil society institution. Political parties, all of them except the NSDAP, were either banned or dissolved themselves under pressure within a few months. By July 1933, Germany was officially a one-party state. Trade unions, independent labor organizations were smashed on May 2, 1933. Their assets were seized. In their place, the German Labor Front was created, a Nazi organization controlling labor relations. The federal states, Germany's federal structure, was effectively destroyed. Regional state governments were subordinated to central authority through appointed governors, Reichsstatthalter. The press and independent newspapers were either shut down or subjected to harsh censorship. A propaganda ministry was created, headed by Joseph Goebbels, which controlled all media. Culture, the Reich Chamber of Culture, controlled literature, film, music, and the visual arts. Works deemed degenerate were confiscated. On May 10, 1933, public book burnings took place across Germany. Works by Jewish, liberal, leftist, and pacifist authors went up in flames. Education curricula were rewritten in line with Nazi ideology. The Hitler Youth was established to indoctrinate young people from an early age. Each of these processes unfolded relatively quickly, within a few months. And each was accompanied by a combination of coercion and voluntary accommodation. Many German institutions submitted to the new authority without waiting for direct violence, hoping to preserve at least some autonomy or simply out of conformism. By 1934, the Nazi regime had one last serious internal threat remaining. The SA stormtroopers, the Sturmabteilung, originally the party's street-fighting paramilitary force, had by this point swelled to several million members, far outnumbering the regular German army, the Reichswehr. SA leader Ernst Röhm, Hitler's longtime comrade dating back to the beer hall putsch, believed the Nazi revolution should continue. He wanted the SA to absorb or replace the regular army, creating a genuinely revolutionary people's armed force. This created a serious conflict of interest. The Reichswehr's military leadership, the traditional Prussian military elite, categorically refused to subordinate itself to Röhm's plebeian stormtroopers. The army was one of the last institutions whose full loyalty Hitler hadn't yet secured. Industrialists and the conservative elite who had supported Hitler's rise to power were unsettled by Röhm's social revolutionary rhetoric, who spoke of a second revolution, this time a social and economic one. Hitler faced a choice: between his old comrades from the street fighting days and the support of the traditional elite, above all the army, whose loyalty was essential for consolidating full power, especially given the advanced age and failing health of President Hindenburg. Hitler chose the army. On the night of June 30th to July 1st, 1934, an event that entered history as the Night of the Long Knives, SS units, Hitler's personal guard, acting on the Führer's orders, arrested and killed the SA leadership, including Röhm personally. Other political opponents unconnected to the SA were also eliminated at the same time. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, conservative critics of the regime, old personal enemies. The exact death toll is unknown. Estimates range from 85 to over 200 people killed without trial over the course of several days. This act of mass extrajudicial killing was subsequently legalized retroactively by the Reichstag, the one legislative chamber that still formally existed, and which obediently voted to recognize the murders as legitimate self-defense of the state. The Night of the Long Knives carried enormous significance for the regime's consolidation. The army, having watched a rival armed force eliminated, expressed gratitude to Hitler. President Hindenburg personally sent Hitler a telegram congratulating him on suppressing treason against the state. The SS, the organization that carried out the killings, grew dramatically in influence, transforming from a small subdivision of the SA into an independent and increasingly dominant force within the regime, under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler. On August 2, 1934, President Paul von Hindenburg died at the age of 86. This removed the last formal obstacle on the path to total dictatorship. Even before Hindenburg's death, the cabinet had already passed a law merging the offices of President and Chancellor into a single position, Führer and Reich Chancellor, which Hitler immediately assumed. This law formally violated even the 1933 Enabling Act, which hadn't envisioned any change to the structure of the presidency itself. But by this point, any constitutional limitations existed only in name. On August 2, 1934, Hitler became the absolute ruler of Germany, head of state, head of government, and, critically, supreme commander of the armed forces. That same day, the German army swore a new oath, not to the state, not to the Constitution, but to Adolf Hitler personally. This deeply personal nature of the military oath carried enormous weight in subsequent years. When Reichswehr officers, and later Wehrmacht officers, considered resisting criminal orders or joining conspiracies against the regime, this personal oath remained a psychological and legal barrier for many of them all the way up to 1944. On August 19, 1934, a plebiscite was held to confirm the merger of the offices. Official results: 89.9% in favor. The reliability of this result is seriously questionable, given the absence of a free press, opposition parties, and the climate of fear that had already taken hold of the country by this point. But even accounting for possible manipulation, a significant portion of the German population genuinely did support Hitler by this time, partly due to real economic gains in the first year and a half of his rule, a reduction in official unemployment through large-scale public works programs and covert rearmament. So, how was the Reich born? Not in a single moment. Not through a single decision. Not through one villain acting alone. The Reich was born out of a sequence of crises the system couldn't absorb. Out of a defeat that was never honestly processed. Out of a peace that humiliated instead of integrating. Out of economic catastrophes that destroyed the middle class. Twice, in 1923 and again in 1929 to 1933. Out of a democracy that existed formally but lacked enough defenders willing to fight for it. Out of a conservative elite that thought it could use a radical for its own purposes. Out of a judicial system that didn't take right-wing extremism seriously. Out of an army whose loyalty to the Republic was always questionable. And out of countless small decisions, each of which in isolation might have seemed reasonable or, at the very least, not catastrophic at the moment it was made. A lenient sentence for the beer hall putsch. Pappen's decision to use Hitler. The decree following the Reichstag fire. The vote for the Enabling Act. A military oath sworn personally to the Führer. Each of these decisions was made by specific people in specific circumstances, often with motives that were, by their own internal logic, rational. None of them presumably fully foresaw where it would all lead. To Auschwitz. to 40 million dead on the Eastern Front alone, to the complete destruction of the German state and German cities under bombs and shells. This is perhaps the most frightening lesson of how the Reich was born. Not that evil arrived suddenly, in the form of an obvious and recognizable monster against which everyone could immediately unite, but that evil arrived gradually, step by step, through decisions that, at each individual stage, could be rationalized, justified, treated as temporary, or as a necessary compromise. By the time it became obvious where all of this was heading, the mechanisms of resistance had already been dismantled. Parliament, powerless. The press, under control. The courts, compliant. The army, sworn personally to the dictator. Opposition parties, destroyed or in exile. The Reich wasn't born in a single night. It was born over 16 years. And this slow birth is, perhaps, the most important thing to understand about how totalitarianism comes to power. Not always through a coup. Sometimes, step by step, through legal procedures, through compromises that seemed reasonable at the moment they were made, through institutions that voluntarily surrendered their authority, hoping to hold on to something, anything, in the end. If this story mattered to you, hit like. Tell me in the comments which of these steps feels like the most decisive turning point to you, the moment after which stopping the process became practically impossible. History doesn't repeat itself literally, but the mechanisms are recognizable.